Okay, so in this tutorial I'm going to just go over how to set up a quick physical sun and sky with a kind of infinite dome, a reverse dome, a backdrop that we won't see any hard edges as we rotate around our object. So I just have this widget that I created as part of an earlier example in class. I'm going to use that as my pretend object that I want to showcase. And so I'm not going to worry about materials or anything here, but you know, if we went ahead and polygons, we just created a plane and we put our object on it. It creates kind of visual distraction in my mind. This edge that we're seeing, we would see just kind of this background that the physical sun and sky will give us, and then we're going to give this ground plane. There are some ways to tweak that so you could try to blend it into the physical sun and sky, but I wanted to try this other method here. We're going to create a cylinder, and I'm just going to scale this up a little bit for starters. And I'm going to go into the paint selection mode. I'm holding down B to make the brush a little bit bigger. I'm going to right click and say face, and just go ahead and delete those. Alright, the other thing I want to do here is when I'm scaling up this object, I want to scale it from the bottom. So I'm going to right click and say object, and I'll move the pivot point and snap it down to that center. So if I hold down the D key, you can see that I get the my transform widget changes a little bit so that I'm just moving the pivot point. And then if I either snap the point up here, or V is the hotkey for it, I can snap it down. Oops. I can snap it right down onto that point that's at the center. Right? So I held down D and V, dragged it down until it snapped, and then let go. So now I can, oops, let's go to right view. I'm going to go ahead and just put this at the bottom so that my object is resting on it the way I want it. And if I decide I need to scale it, it will just scale while still staying put on the ground. Okay, so that's pretty good for starters. Got this dome in here. Sorry, this reverse dome. So if I hit 3, you can see I get kind of this rounding if I go into smooth mesh, but it's really not a lot of edges in here. That's probably going to cause a little bit of a problem and some pinching down here. So I just need to include one more edge, a couple little edge loops in here. So we'll use a tool we haven't used much in class yet. We're going to use, instead of insert edge loop, I'm going to use the offset edge loop tool. And you can see that edge is selected, so if I just, oops, if I click on that edge and I'm holding down the left mouse button and dragging out, you can see that it's going to insert edges on either side of the selected edge. So if I let go, you can see I gave it a little bit of spacing. Now I get kind of a nice smooth ramp. And as I rotate, I won't have any kind of visual distraction in the background, or I shouldn't at least. Right? And this is just one, possible option. I mean, it's not like this is the be-all, end-all of how to do that, but it's just a suggestion, I guess. All right, so we have our backdrop in here. We have our object. If I go ahead and just press, oops, let me actually hit escape here. Let me turn off something that I had turned on before. Let's delete that. Turn that off. All right, so here's just a default Maya render. We don't have any lights in the scene, and we have no shadows or anything like that. I do have a few of the MIA materials on there. You can see the reflections and things working. All right. So what I'm suggesting for this project is just a simple use of this physical sun and sky. And the way that we get to that is we go to the render settings underneath indirect lighting tab. Right? We're just going to hit create. It's going to turn on final gather for us. It's also going to create a directional light. And this directional light, I'm just going to move it up here, controls the angle that the sun is looking at the object. Right? So if I went ahead and render now, And see it's going through its final gather pass. Going through and kind of completing its render. All right, so I have kind of a smooth background here. This looks pretty good. You can see I have the shadow from the side here is a little distracting to me. I don't really want that. But I do want the shadow from the object on the ground. So how am I going to deal with that? I'm going to select this background object that we've created and make sure you go into the attribute editor. And underneath render stats, we're going to turn off cast shadows. So within the render settings, there's lots of things that an individual object can contribute to the render. We're just going to turn it to turn the cast shadows off. We still want it to receive shadows because we want the shadows from the object on the ground. So let's just go ahead and render again. Alright, so you can see I get a little bit of a gradient in the background, but it's soft, it's not too distracting. I could make that bevel softer if I wanted to, but for the purposes of this, I think it works just fine. Alright, so let's get to adding a camera now. Or let's just do, in fact, instead of adding a camera, let's just go over the basics of keyframing. We're going to animate our object. So I've taken all the objects that are in the scene and I've grouped them. So the way you would do that, just select all your objects here, deselect. We don't want the background cylinder, we want that to stay there. And then you should be able to just do edit and group. If you have these selected, it's not a bad idea to do modify freeze transformations. So you can get rid of any scaling or rotation, things that you might have done to the object. And then again, after you've done that, do edit group. So we put them all in a group, and you can see in my outliner I have object group. So I'm going to move my time slider, let's see here, got this already set up to 100, 120. If you need to change what's visible for the project that you're rendering, we have frame 1. If this is set at the default, probably says something like this. Alright, so you can see just 24 frames. You can stretch the range slider. I'm just going to make this 120 frames. Alright, I'm going to go to the very beginning and select Object. And I'm going to highlight all the rotate attributes. I really only need the Y, but it's good practice when you're keyframing rotation to do all of them. And I'm going to right-click with those selected and say Key Selected. And you now see that these channels are highlighted red to show that there's animation information on it now, right? So I'm going to move to frame 120, and let's see, how do I want this to maybe just rotate like this? And let's do 150 degrees maybe. Oops. Let's put that at 0. I think that was supposed to be negative, yeah. Negative 150. Highlight those again. I'm making sure that my time slider now is at frame 120, and I'm going to right click and say Key Selected. Alright. That keyframe won't be recorded unless you right click and say Key Selected, unless you have the Auto Keyframe button turned on, which I advise you not use at this point until you're used to keyframing on your own, because you can accidentally start making a bunch of changes and end up with more keyframes than you were really prepared for. So let's go back to the very beginning. Now I can press play, and you can see here's my rotation set up around my object. The one thing I want to make sure is that everything's framed the way I want. So I'm going to go to the render settings to start with and go to the common tab. And we'll do the render settings here in a sec. Just make sure that it says 960 by 540. That's the size we're going to render out. And we'll click on this button here, which is the resolution gate. And this shows me what the camera is going to render out. Anything in this box, this is what the image will be. This is not going to be included in the render. So as you move your camera up, just make sure, over or whatever you want to do, make sure you frame your object. in a way that we're looking primarily at your object. We don't want to look at an animation like this, right? This probably defeats the point. Okay. Okay, so we've got a camera spinning. We have our background set up. Let's just go over the render settings really quick. When you do this, you want to make sure that you have set your project so that you're using, let's do this by name. You're using the project that you've been working into. So if I set that, the TIE Fighter project, my renders are all going to go into the image folder. So I'll just say set. I think I already had it set. If I go to the render settings, and at the very top here, you can see the path is user to my Dropbox TIE Fighter images folder, and it's going to save. I've given it a name, the file name. I'm just going to call this widget. I chose PNGs. We need to change the frame animation extension so that it says name number extension. The default, I think, is this name extension single frame. So we need to record multiple frames. We'll leave the frame padding at 4. We'll change the number of frames that we're going to do, 1 to 120. And then we need to select a camera. So in this case, I could use the perspective camera if I wanted to, or I'm actually going to create a camera. So create camera, camera. Go into the panels, perspective, and choose camera 1. Let's turn on our resolution gate. I'm just creating the camera so that, you know, if I wanted to animate anything about the camera, I could do it there. I don't want to do that with the perspective camera. Right? So that's fine. So let's go back to the render settings. Renderable camera, didn't have one, so I'm going to say camera 1. That's what I'm going to look through when I render my images, and we'll leave those defaults right there. Okay, and then the last thing would be rendering, render, batch render, and this will send out all of our frames. We're not going to see it, we're not going to see the rendering happening here, but if we go to our directory, we should see those images showing up in the image folder of our project. Okay, I think that's it.